I realized something was off the moment I stepped into our apartment that Friday evening and smelled the faint, unfamiliar scent lingering in the hallway. I couldn't name it at first, somewhere between perfume and detergent, but it was enough to make me pause by the door and listen. She was in the kitchen, humming, moving slowly, deliberately, like she wanted the sound of her presence to reach me before I saw her. I said nothing. I didn't want to make a scene, and yet my chest tightened as I watched her stir a pot on the stove. Her back was to me, her hair tied loosely, a few strands brushing her neck. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. She could have been at the store, at a friend's house, maybe someone had borrowed her shampoo. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. We ate dinner in silence, a kind of quiet I hadn't known before. I made a few attempts at small talk about work, the weather, the neighbor's dog, but she replied with clipped sentences, her eyes glancing toward her phone every few minutes. She laughed at something, softly, but the sound felt distant, as if it were meant for someone else. Later, I found myself sitting on the couch, staring at my hands, wondering how long I had been missing this. The slight withdrawals, the subtle shifts in tone, the way she avoided my gaze when I mentioned plans for the weekend. My mind played through old conversations, trying to find the moment I had stopped noticing, the moment the trust had thinned. I knew I would ask her eventually. I didn't know if I was ready for the answer, and maybe that was worse. The uncertainty clawed at me quietly, a constant, soft ache. I went to bed that night with my side of the sheets untouched, listening to the subtle creak of the apartment settling, my mind spinning in the dark. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, pretending to make coffee while watching her move around. She smiled at me, but it was thin, almost practiced, and I found myself studying the way her fingers hovered over the counter, the way she tilted her head when she answered my questions. There was something in her movements, an unfamiliar caution that I couldn't name. "I'm meeting Sarah for lunch today," she said casually, sipping her tea. I paused mid-pour, letting the coffee drip into the mug, steady but careful. "Sarah?" My voice was calmer than I felt. "Yeah. She just got back from her trip. I thought we could catch up." Her eyes didn't linger on mine. I nodded. "Okay. Sounds good." She left shortly after, leaving me in the apartment with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint lingering scent from last night. I walked slowly to the living room, noticing the subtle disorder she'd left behind. An open notebook, a pair of earrings not in their box. The ordinary details now felt like markers, hints of something I wasn't supposed to see. All day, I found myself checking my phone compulsively, rereading messages she'd sent the night before, looking for clues where none existed. Part of me hated myself for doubting her, for letting suspicion creep into the corners of our home. But the other part, quiet, insistent, refused to let it go. I replayed her laughter from yesterday, the glance at her phone, the faint hesitation in her voice. Each memory, I realized, had begun to feel different in light of this unease, as if I had been misreading her all along, or worse, finally seeing what had always been there. By evening, she returned. Her smile was warmer this time, casual, effortless, as though nothing had shifted. I wanted to ask, to confront, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, we sat on the couch, pretending the morning hadn't existed. I watched her from the corner of my eye, noting the small gestures, the way she flicked through her phone before setting it face down on the table. Something in me tightened, but I kept my silence. It was easier to wait and watch, I told myself, though the waiting was already a quiet kind of torture. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept turning over fragments of her day in my mind, her lunch, her smile, the way she spoke about Sarah. And each piece felt slightly off, like a note in a song that was just out of key. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that my mind was weaving a story out of nothing. But the more I tried to push it away, the louder it became. The next morning, I decided to follow the only thread I had, her routine. Not out of malice, but from a need to see the truth, even if it hurt. I didn't go far, just enough to watch her car leave, to see if it headed where she said it would. She drove to a cafe I didn't recognize, parked, and met someone almost immediately. They hugged, briefly, casually, with a familiarity that didn't sit right. I couldn't hear their words, couldn't see their faces clearly, but the body language was enough. I walked home, my thoughts running faster than my steps. I tried to argue with myself, rationalize it. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe the hug was innocent. Maybe I was projecting fear onto what I had seen. But deep down, I knew there was a line I had crossed the moment I had started to notice the small silences, the little absences, the change in tone. When she returned that evening, she was cheerful, unaware of the storm building quietly inside me. I asked her casually about her day, about the cafe, about Sarah, and she answered without hesitation, her voice light and unconcerned. I nodded along, said the right words, but my stomach churned with tension I couldn't hide. I didn't confront her, couldn't. Instead, I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing beside me, feeling a quiet, sharp ache in my chest. I tried to imagine she was telling the truth, that there was nothing hidden, but I couldn't. The suspicion had taken root, and every little gesture now carried double meaning. The days that followed were quiet but heavy. I found myself scanning her messages when she left the room, hesitating over words that seemed ordinary at first glance but now felt loaded. A single line, a simple "see you later," could ignite a dozen scenarios in my mind. I hated the suspicion, hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. I started noticing her habits in a way I hadn't before. The way she locked her phone when I entered the kitchen. The way she lingered over certain texts before replying. The way her laughter seemed just a little too forced when she was distracted. Each small act, each subtle change, chipped away at the foundation of trust one had built over years. One evening, I tried to speak to her, carefully, almost gently, testing the water. "Do you ever feel like we're distant?" My voice was betrayed none of the panic that hummed beneath it. She looked up from her book, surprised. "Distant? I don't know, maybe a little, sometimes." "Why?" I don't know. Sometimes I feel like you're somewhere else, even when you're here." She gave me a small, tired smile. "I'm here. I'm always here." Her words should have been enough. But they weren't. They never were. That night, I lay awake again, listening to her breathing beside me, feeling a quiet, sharp ache in my chest. I tried to imagine she was telling the truth, that there was nothing hidden, but I couldn't. The suspicion had taken root, and every little gesture now carried double meaning. I wondered if this was how it always began, the slow unraveling, the quiet drift. The thought was more painful than any confrontation, more unbearable than a single accusation. I felt trapped between my fear and my love, unable to speak, unable to look away, unable to trust myself. I started keeping track of her schedule, almost obsessively, as if mapping her days would give me clarity. I knew it was unhealthy, knew it was a kind of self-torture, but I couldn't stop. I noted the times she left the apartment, the places she went, the slight inconsistencies in her explanations. Each discrepancy, no matter how small, lodged itself in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. One Thursday evening, she returned later than she had said. I was sitting on the couch pretending to read, though my eyes never left the doorway. When she walked in, I noticed her expression first. A flicker of something fleeting, quickly masked by a smile. "Traffic," she said. "Sorry, it took longer than I thought." I nodded. "No problem." My voice was calm, neutral. Inside, though, something tightened in my chest. I went to the kitchen, pretending to make tea, listening to her moving around, noting the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she reached for a glass. She laughed at something on the news, and the sound grated against me. It was too loud, too bright, too careful. I wanted to ask her what she was hiding, but the words wouldn't come. Later, I sat on the balcony, alone, staring at the city lights and thinking about the quiet distance that had grown between us. It wasn't just the actions I had seen. It was the way I now viewed her, the way doubt had taken root in my mind and refused to leave. I realized that even if everything were innocent, I had already crossed a line. I had begun to suspect, to measure, to look for betrayal in ordinary moments. By the time she joined me outside, carrying her cup of tea, I felt a sharp pang of guilt. She asked if I wanted to talk about something. I shook my head. Not right now, I said. But in truth, the conversation had already begun inside me, in the quiet chambers of suspicion and fear. That weekend, I noticed her phone buzzing more frequently, the screen lighting up with names I didn't recognize. She kept it face down on the table now, a subtle but deliberate shift I couldn't ignore. I told myself to be patient, to trust, but the quiet anxiety in my chest had grown into a constant companion. On Sunday morning, I was up early. She was still asleep, her breathing slow and even. I watched her for a while, the sunlight catching the curve of her cheek, her hair spread across the pillow. I hated the way my mind drifted, to imagining her with someone else, to replaying every small sign, every tiny hint. I hated that I couldn't stop. When she woke, I tried to keep the day normal. We walked to the nearby park, bought coffee, sat on a bench watching people pass. I laughed at her jokes, commented on a dog that ran past, smiled at a mother with her child. But behind every moment, a quiet tension lingered, a dull ache that refused to leave. Later, when we sat by the fountain eating pastries, she mentioned a colleague who had invited her to a small dinner that evening. I nodded automatically, not trusting my own voice to sound neutral. I don't think I'll go, she added quickly. I'd rather stay in, spend time with you. Her words should have been a relief. They weren't. I couldn't shake the thought that it was an afterthought, a careful phrasing meant to reassure me while hiding something else. I didn't ask, didn't comment. We sat in a heavy silence for a few minutes, watching the water ripple, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we returned home, I stayed on the balcony, drinking tea, staring at the city below. She was inside, humming softly, moving between rooms. I realized I had begun to measure her presence not by shared moments, but by the spaces she left, the small absences that now felt immense. By nightfall, I was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally, drained from the quiet vigilance I had imposed on myself. Trust, I understood now, wasn't something easily repaired once it had cracked. Even if nothing had happened, even if she remained faithful, I had already begun to inhabit a world where betrayal was always possible. Midweek, I found myself lingering near the doorway when she left for work, just to watch her go. Her steps were the same casual swing of her bag, the same turn of her head as she disappeared around the corner. And yet, in my mind, nothing was the same. Every movement was freighted with suspicion. Every smile she gave someone else a quiet accusation I couldn't voice. That evening, I tried to speak, to bridge the growing distance between us. Do you feel satisfied? With us? My voice was careful, neutral, but my heart thumped as if it would betray me. She looked at me, startled by the question, and for a moment, I thought I saw hesitation. Then she shook her head slightly and said, I don't know. I think we're fine. Her answer didn't comfort me. It never had. I had begun to measure our relationship not by what she said, but by what she left unsaid, by the spaces between words, the pauses in her sentences, the fleeting expressions her face betrayed. Later that night, I checked her messages again, though I told myself it was only to confirm my own sanity. I noticed one I hadn't seen before, from someone named Daniel. Nothing overtly alarming, just a short text, casual, but my chest tightened. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if I was imagining the significance, if my mind had become a dangerous lens, magnifying ordinary things into betrayals. When she returned home, I asked casually, Did you hear from Daniel today? Oh yeah, he just asked about the meeting we had last week. Nothing important. Her tone was calm, deliberate. I nodded, saying nothing further. But later, lying awake, I realized the truth was already clear to me. It didn't matter if there was a real betrayal or not. I was living inside a quiet, relentless suspicion that had taken over my thoughts, my feelings, my ability to trust. And I hated myself for it, perhaps more than I feared what she might have done. By the weekend, the tension between us had grown so subtle I could almost forget it, and then she would do something. A look, a laugh at a text, a slight hesitation, and it would crash over me again. I found myself withdrawing, not out of anger, but from a desperate, unspoken need to protect myself from disappointment. Saturday morning, she suggested we visit the market together. I agreed, though my mind was elsewhere, cataloging her words, her gestures, the way she moved between stalls, chatting with strangers with a brightness I no longer felt I shared. I smiled, but it felt hollow, a performance I could no longer believe in. Later, when we sat by the fountain eating pastries, she mentioned a colleague who had invited her to a small dinner that evening. I nodded automatically, not trusting my own voice to sound neutral. "I don't think I'll go," she added quickly. "I'd rather stay in, spend time with you." Her words should have been a relief. They weren't. I couldn't shake the thought that it was an afterthought, a careful phrasing meant to reassure me while hiding something else. I didn't ask, didn't comment. We sat in a heavy silence for a few minutes, watching the water ripple, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we returned home, I stayed on the balcony, drinking tea, staring at the city below. She was inside, humming softly, moving between rooms. I realized I had begun to measure her presence not by shared moments, but by the spaces she left, the small absences that now felt immense. By nightfall, I was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally, drained from the quiet vigilance I had imposed on myself. Trust, I understood now, wasn't something easily repaired once it had cracked. Even if nothing had happened, even if she remained faithful, I had already begun to inhabit a world where betrayal was always possible. Monday came with its usual rhythm, but I moved through it like a shadow, silent, tense, observing rather than participating. At work, I caught myself replaying small interactions from the weekend. How she had laughed at a vendor's joke, the way she had glanced at her phone while talking to me, the slight hesitation in her voice when she mentioned her colleague. Each memory was a tiny fracture, widening in my mind. That evening, she suggested cooking together. I agreed, though my movements were automatic, my mind elsewhere. We chopped vegetables side by side, the knife tapping against the cutting board in steady, measured rhythms. I watched her carefully, noting every glance, every gesture, every pause. "You've been quiet," she said finally, stopping mid-chop. "Is something bothering you?" I wanted to tell her, to spill the doubts that had grown inside me like a hidden wound. But I didn't. Instead, I shook my head. "Just tired, I guess." She studied me for a moment, then nodded and returned to her cooking. I realized how much space I had given the suspicion room to grow, how much it had shaped my perception of her, of us. And in that moment, I felt a profound ache. Not anger, not betrayal, but grief. Grief for the trust one could no longer access, grief for the intimacy that had quietly slipped away, grief for the version of myself that could love without doubt. By the following week, I realized I had changed. Not outwardly, not in ways anyone else could see, but in the slow, steady reshaping of my mind and heart. I no longer listened to her words as they were spoken. I listened for what they might conceal. I no longer trusted her presence in the room, only measured it. The intimacy we had shared, the ease of conversation, the comfort of closeness, had dissolved into a quiet tension I couldn't name, couldn't escape. One evening, she reached for my hand as we sat on the couch. I felt the familiar urge to pull back, to shield myself from disappointment, but I stayed still. I didn't speak. I didn't ask for reassurances. I simply let the hand rest in mine, feeling the warmth, the softness, and yet knowing that between us, a silent gulf had formed. I thought about confronting her, about demanding the truth, about reclaiming the trust one had lost. But I understood, finally, that some betrayals, real or imagined, cannot be mended by words. They live quietly in the spaces between people, in the glances that linger too long, in the questions we cannot ask without fear. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing beside me. I didn't know what the truth was, and I didn't know if it mattered anymore. What mattered was the change in me, the shift in our world, the loss of certainty that had once been effortless. I realized then that heartbreak does not always come in storms. Sometimes it comes quietly, patiently, like a shadow stretching across a room. And once it has settled, it never fully leaves, no matter how much light we try to bring in. I held her hand a little tighter, not because I trusted it, not because I was certain, but because it was all I could do, to exist alongside the ache, to live with the silence, and to keep going.